Rainier Valley Historical Society's mission is to collect. Our boundaries are from Dearborn Street to Seattle city limits and from I-5 to Lake Washington. Rainier Valley Historical Society acknowledges the land our mission statement refers to as Rainier Valley is the traditional lands of the Duwamish and Coast Salish peoples. We recognize the reverberation of colonialism, past and present, and the painful history of forced removal of these groups. Through this acknowledgement, we hope to honor and respect the Indigenous peoples who were and still are connected to and are stewards of this land. This burial ground has gone by many names in its roughly 126 years. When looking through historical records, you find the cemetery listed as IOOF Cemetery, Georgetown Cemetery, or IOOF Georgetown Cemetery. As far as we can tell, Comet Lodge Cemetery appears on the plat map in the 1890s only, most likely to differentiate several other cemeteries owned in the area by the IOOF. The number of IOOF cemeteries in the area can make finding some records challenging. The first known settler burial at Comet Lodge Cemetery was Samuel Maple, sometimes spelled M-A-P-E-L or M-A-P-L-E. Samuel had traveled with the Collins party along with his father. Dying in 1880 at the age of 53, the Maples owned the property. His father was buried here in 1884, and they remained until 1930-1940. Their remains were cremated and reinterred to a memorial spot at the King County International Airport. There is a plaque that memorializes their status as some of the first pioneers in the area. In 1895, the Independent Order of Oddfellows, or IOOF, Comet Lodge, number 126, purchased the land for a cemetery. Comet Lodge, number 126, operated the cemetery from their purchasing of it in 1895 until 1939. The last burial recorded for the property was that of 6-year-old Jewel Ludden, who had died of diphtheria. For most of the 1930s, Comet Lodge had difficulty maintaining the area and issues paying the cemetery's taxes. They began alerting family members of those interred that now they had a responsibility to care for the plots. The city of Seattle foreclosed on the property in the late 1930s. The cemetery continued to have troubles into the 1980s and 1990s, which I will discuss later. The record of how many people exactly are buried in Comet Lodge is tricky to figure out. According to a semi-official list, there are 490 burials. 24 of those gravestones remain. Out of that number, there are 25 disinterments recorded. The people buried in Comet Lodge Cemetery came from a variety of backgrounds, ages, and ethnicities. Our first stop on our tour is the cenotaph of Augustus Twembley. A laborer by trade, he died in a shaft cave-in caused by a boiler explosion at the Seattle County Oil Company's works located in South Park on April 29, 1901. He was 30 years old. His death shows up as the 133rd death of the year caused by a boiler explosion in the Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company's monthly newsletter, Locomotive. The first distinctive thing you will notice about his gravestone is its shape. Typically referred to as a Woodman of the World monument, the tree-shaped column has its branches cut off to symbolize a life cut short. The monument type was widespread in use with the fraternal organization from the 1890s until around 1930. Typically, the decorations around the base of the tree and on the trunk itself would give some more personal touches, giving insight into the interests or personality of the deceased. It is also important to note that these stones were easily purchased through Sears and Roebuck catalogs, making them a popular choice overall. Mr. Twembley, however, was a member of the Woodmen of the World. The phrase at the top of the gravestone reads Dum Tagit Calmat, or translated, though silent, he speaks, the motto of the organization. The Woodmen of the World, which then changed its name to Modern Woodmen of America, was created to disperse insurance and erect gravestones for its members. As time went on, however, it became more difficult for the organization to purchase headstones for their membership. Originally part of your insurance deal, by 1902, it became a $100 add-on, adjusting for inflation to $3,211.80. To purchase a headstone from Sears and Roebuck, however, cost roughly the same amount. It is also at this location I will mention that almost all of these headstones are technically cenotaphs. Most of the stones are no longer in their proper place. These headstones are simply now monuments to someone who may be buried elsewhere in this cemetery, or in some cases was moved to another cemetery. We do not know much about Ernest Pick. From census records, we know that he lived in Idaho as a baker in 1900 and in Spokane, Washington in 1903 in a hotel. While we do not have much information on his life, his grave is one of the most visually interesting still standing. The ferns typically symbolize humility, frankness, and sincerity, and you can find them as well on Augustus Twembley's grave. Ivy stands for immortality and fidelity. Usually, the three leaves tend to make it a symbol of the Holy Trinity as well. The shaking hands, which are hard to see but are at the bottom of the stone, typically stand for a symbol of matrimony. When this is the case, one sleeve should be considered feminine and the other one should look more masculine. However, if the sleeves are more gender neutral, they usually represent a heavenly welcome or an earthly farewell. Dr. Emma A. Rigby was a doctor who worked in South Park for 15 years. One of the first female doctors in the area, she would also have been one of the first women to go to medical school. You can find her signature throughout the archives from the 1890s to 1906. One of two doctors in South Park, she attended the births and deaths of many of its residents. At 56, she died while at King County Hospital in surgery to take care of an inflamed gallbladder caught too late. She was born, however, Emmeline Adelaide Fleming, on August 1845 to Solomon Saul Fleming and Sarah Dudley Fleming in Florence, Oneida County, New York. She was the youngest of 6 children. By 1870, she was married to Alfred Hazon Wakefield and a milliner. The 1875 New York State Census, however, shows her as the head of her household and as a business owner. In 1878, she won her divorce case on the grounds of adultery. By 1880-1881, it appears that Emma married again, this time to David Curtis, and took in her great niece, Gracie May Sherman, or Gracie May Curtis, as some records have her. It is around this time that she also most likely received her medical degree, as Illinois, where she was living, was one of the few states that had medical schools that allowed women to receive medical degrees at the time. Unfortunately, David Curtis and Emma's sister, Sarah, died in 1888 in Falcton, South Dakota, leaving Emma and Gracie May in the frontier. In 1892, Emma reappears in records in Walla Walla with a new husband, Elmer C. Rigby, and 2 more children, Zula and Layla. Dr. Rigby, Reverend Rigby, and their children would move shortly thereafter to the South Park area, where Emma would continue her practice for the next 15 years before her death. Julia Frances Bailey was born Julia Frances Birch in 1883 in Indiana to John Birch and Julia Frances, whose maiden name is unknown. Meeting her husband, John S. Bailey, most likely in Wisconsin in the 1860s, they married in 1862. John S. Bailey is in Civil War draft papers for the state. His job was a barber. Not much is known about their childhoods or lives before the 1860s. Their marriage certificate is even hard to find, as both Julia and her husband were black. For the most part, you can track their family through the 1870 and 1880 censuses. The couple had 5 children, 3 of which reached adulthood, one of them being Miss Florence Bailey to your left. John died in 1892, according to Wisconsin state records, which was most likely their impetus to move out west to Washington. Julia's sons, William and George, opened up their hair salon in South Park, and Florence became a domestic for a private family in the area. Julia worked as a dressmaker who worked from her home, a small cottage in the River Addition of South Park. Florence was 46 when she died in 1908 of aortic inefficiency brought on by bronchopneumonia followed by La Grippe. Julia Frances passed away in 1911 from organic heart disease and general debility at the age of 78. Her son George was left in charge of her estate and struggled to pay everything that was needed. In the end, H.S. Noyce, a local undertaker, owner of the IOOF Georgetown Cemetery, and a member of Comet Lodge No. 126, took over as executor. As executor of her will, and as payment for the remainder of her funeral expenses, Mr. Noyce became the sole benefactor of the property Julia owned. Mrs. Frances Euphemia M. Austin Smith Hodges passed away on May 9, 1926, leaving the legacy of a poet. Though her poetry may not be well known today, she had made quite a name for herself. Mentioned in A Woman of the Century, 1470 biographical sketches accompanied by portraits of leading American women in all walks of life, and the Magazine of Poetry, Volume 5, her work got readership. In 1895, she married Lionel Edward Foley Hodges in Ontario. After her marriage, it seems that she did not continue to publish poetry. In 1903, she and her husband immigrated to the United States. Born to German immigrants in Wisconsin, Katherine Albrecht was one of 5 children. Both her mother and father are also in Comet Lodge Cemetery, although their stones no longer remain. She died at the age of 19 of diphtheria in 1904. Before that, however, she lived at 1418 Yesler Way with her family and then moved into the Duwamish neighborhood to Country Road No. 57, house No. 3, where she worked as a housekeeper for the Ward family. Diphtheria, as of 2021, is nearly unheard of in the United States. 3 cases were reported to the CDC in 2020, with 2 deaths reported. If you've heard of diphtheria, you've most likely heard it through the story of Balto. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, however, diphtheria was an infection that was prevalent and deadly. The mortality statistics put out by the federal government listed it as epidemic disease. Overall, in the United States, 28.6 people out of every 100,000 died, and in Seattle itself, 40.7 people out of 100,000 died. For reference, out of the estimated 95,803 lived in Seattle, and 82,166,000 lived in the United States during 1904. Next to Katherine Albrecht is the gravestone of Laura A. Hartfield. She was a member of the Women of Woodcraft. The Women of Woodcraft was a splintering off of the Woodmen of the World, a fraternal benefit society. They would become, in the early 1900s, the Pacific Circle Women of Woodcraft. According to Colorado's Herald-Democrat, in their January 1, 1903 edition, the order then numbered 37,000 members distributed among 527 circles, located in Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Montana, California, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, and Nevada. The group disbursed insurance and money, erected gravestones for their members, and ran a retirement home for older members to live in if they wanted. The Women of Woodcraft, interestingly, had both male and female members. The stipulation was that male members also had to be members of Woodmen of the World. One section of the cemetery that no longer exists anymore is Babyland. Infant mortality rates within the United States did not vary much, generally from the 18th to early 20th century, hovering around the 25% mark, meaning a quarter of all infants were either stillborn or did not reach adulthood, and in some cases, childhood. Because of this rate, many historic cemeteries usually include an area like this. Comet Lodge's cemetery, Babyland, is behind part of Laura Hartfield and Katherine Albrecht's graves. In the 1920s, Dr. Corson, whose name you will maybe recognize from Corson Ave in Georgetown, was a member of Comet Lodge Cemetery and took over part of the cemetery with H.S. Noyce. He, in 1927, sold the land off, taking the small wooden crosses that showed where each grave was off the land. There are no officially written down disinterments of any of the children that were buried there before the houses went up, and some records do show that there might not have been that many burials there to start with. As we reach the end of the tour, we can discuss the more modern history of Comet Lodge Cemetery. After the property foreclosure, the cemetery fell even more into a state of disrepair. There are no records of reinterments or vacating of plots as the cemetery became the size it is today from the 5 acres it originally was. The gates that once protected the cemetery from a majority of vandalism ended up becoming less of a deterrent as the years passed on. People began stealing gravestones, hopefully assuming that their owners had since moved. Most of them had not, as families had moved away or had no one to take care of them. Gravestones that did remain were prone to be vandalized in other ways. You'll note that some of the headstones today have pieces missing, most likely due to that. The cemetery also became overgrown with brush and brambles and became a popular spot for children to explore. In 1987, a cleanup effort began as Don Kipper asked the city permission to take care of the cemetery and clean it up. When bulldozers arrived, they began to bulldoze the gravestones themselves. Allegedly, Don Kipper had dreamed of living in a cemetery. In the 1990s, John Dickinson, a descendant of Samuel Bevan, buried here, asked the city permission to preserve the cemetery. The preservation plan did not go as expected. With more construction of vehicles arriving at the site, the city ordered a stop order, which went ignored until a worker was injured and the county banned him from the property. In 2003, Cleveland High School did a project with HistoryLink.com called These Are Matters of Grave Importance. This project was to understand the history of the place and, in doing so, find valuable connections between the experiences of the neighborhood's first immigrant residents and their own lives. To do this, they helped clean up Comet Lodge Cemetery and cleared brush and looked at the stones. Thank you very much for joining us on this tour of Comet Lodge Cemetery.